Good evening, and welcome to the Asia Pacific Affairs Forum of the Commonwealth Club of California. My name is Kalideep Chaudhary, and I'm especially pleased to have as my guest noted American geneticist, filmmaker, and author, Dr. Dean Hamer. The first time I met Dean was at a scientific conference so niche that there were probably 50 people in the whole world that would have been interested in what we were doing. The number might have been 51, except I wasn't interested in my own research. At any rate, Dean had put up a sign looking for someone to play tennis with, and I gratefully volunteered. And after we had finished the game of tennis, Dean mused out aloud, and he said that he was looking to do something more impactful, work on something that would interest more than 50 people in the whole world. I shrugged my shoulders. Which middle-aged man hasn't wanted to do something more profound? But there it was, 2 years later, on the pages of the most prestigious scientific journal, Science, a paper outlining for the first time at a molecular level how our sexual identities were rooted in our biology. And you have to remember, this was in the early 90s when it was established fact that being gay or homosexual was a perversion, or in many cases, a choice. And in the words of the then Vice President Dan Quayle, the wrong choice. Dean's work had a profound effect and swayed public opinion and profoundly changed the conversation around sexual identity and really inverted the whole debate. And if that wasn't enough, Dean then went on to study faith. His research and books had fundamentally changed scientific and public understanding of human sexuality, of gender and choice, and has led to a renewed debate on faith. He comes with impeccable pedigree. He has a PhD from Harvard. He was the chief of the Gene Structure and Regulation section of the National Cancer Institute. And upon retirement in 2011, he was designated scientific emeritus. He has won numerous awards, including the New York Times Book of the Year author and the Emmy Award. Dean Hamer, welcome to San Francisco. Welcome to the Commonwealth Club.
Thank you. It's really a pleasure to be here.
So, Dean, let's go back to the beginning. What led you to switch your work from studying on something as gene as metallothionein, which you'll agree wasn't the most exciting of genes, and then switching over to study human sexuality?
Yeah. Well, besides the typical middle-aged angst that I was experiencing, I had always been fascinated by the question of what makes people want to have sex in the way that they want to have sex. And for me, as a molecular biologist, I wasn't just interested in who wanted to do what or how they thought about it, but what were the actual underlying mechanisms. But there had never been any way to study that as a biologist. It's easy to study heavy metal ion regulation in metallothionein. You can do everything in a test tube. You can measure everything. But science of sexology was more almost like psychology mixed in with a little bit of religion. There wasn't really a scientific pathway. But I was curious about it because, when you think about it, sex is the driving force of evolution. Sex is the reason that we're here. The one thing we know about all of our ancestors is they had sex with one another. And sex is the only thing that an organism has to do in order to pass on its genes. Of course, to survive a long time, it has to eat, and it has to have land, and it has to do other sorts of behaviors. But sex is the one thing that it absolutely must do. So in a way, it's the most fascinating unsolved question in biology. The second thing that happened simultaneously in the early 90s was that the Genome Project was developing, and it was developing super fast. When I was a graduate student at Harvard, to sequence one little segment of 12 nucleotides was a big deal. Somebody got a Nobel Prize for it. By the time that I was at the NIH, people were churning out huge sequences, and we were about to know the entire genome. And one of the byproducts of that was the ability to compare the genomes of any two individuals, one to another, and to find genes, even if you had no idea what they were or what they were making or what their sequence was or what protein there was, you could find genes simply by comparing genomes nucleotide by nucleotide. So all of a sudden, there was this ability to find genes for things, even when you didn't really know what you were looking for. And it just struck me, wow, if we could find genes that controlled sexuality, we could really learn something at a fundamental level. So I put those two ideas together, and that was the genesis of the idea of looking for sexuality genes.
Now, the insider scuttlebutt tells me that you finessed your way through, that even back then there were challenges, that you insisted that you started working in Kaposi's sarcoma and then switched to sexuality. Or was that the studying of sexuality always was the main intention?
It was always to study sexuality. I wanted to study other medical aspects if it was convenient, but sexuality was definitely the focus. The thing that got me through was that by this time, I was 40, I was a tenured investigator at the National Institutes of Health. And so I was in a really amazing position because at the NIH, once you're tenured, you're supported, your research is funded, and you don't have to write individual grants. So I didn't have to write a special long justification for what I was doing. I just had to show two other scientists at the NIH that what I was doing was reasonable. And that was easy because there was a very strong biological rationale. There was a method to go forward. Nevertheless, when you put the word sexuality into a government application of any sort, people are going to look around. So what I did learn, actually a little bit later on, was that the application got kicked upstairs and upstairs and upstairs, and you know how things happen in the government, and eventually ended up at the Bush White House. This was Bush at that time. It was a Republican administration. And apparently Bush had somebody called Tony Fauci. And Tony Fauci said, oh, Dean Hamer, he's a good scientist. He worked with Phil Leader. Yeah, he's really solid. And that was it. That was the extent of scrutiny that it was required to go through. So it was really unique being able to work at the NIH and have that sort of support without having to pretend that I was doing something else.
And what did your work find? What did your research find?
So, the first thing I found was that there hadn't been a whole lot of research done. There'd been some family studies, but there'd been nothing at the molecular level. So I went back and started studying families. I had been at Harvard Medical School when I was 22 years old. I had left the medical school just to get a PhD because I kind of wasn't interested in patients, but I learned how to put on a white coat and how to do interviews. I got trained as a sexologist, and I started interviewing families, and it was great. And very early on, we found out that the families of gay men often had other gay men, usually on the mother's side of the family. And as a geneticist, this was fascinating because that's a characteristic of genes that are carried on the X chromosome, because moms are the only ones who pass on an X to their sons. So that was really interesting, just from that classic study. And meanwhile, we started collecting DNA samples from everybody and analyzing the DNA samples. That takes a much longer time. We were basically collecting and analyzing for a long time. And it wasn't for a full year or more that we began to look at the results. When we did, we found something striking. And that is that a majority of the gay brothers we were studying shared a short segment of their DNA. And it was a short segment on the X chromosome. And that was indicative that there was something in that bit of DNA that was somehow tilting these guys to be gay and not to be straight.
Explain to our audience the relevance behind the maternal gene.
Yeah. So maternal genes are especially interesting because they're passed down through the mother's side. So your brother might have the same gene, your mother's brother might have the same gene, and so on through the family, but it won't come through the father's side. And what's interesting about genes on the X chromosome is that you, as a male, only have one copy. So there's no dominance or recessiveness. Genes aren't hidden. If there's a gene on the X chromosome that tends to make you gay, that will be expressed in you. So this is a really important point. It means also your sister may have 2 copies of the same gene, so it's going to act a little bit differently in females. So genes that are involved in sex, being on the sex chromosome, gives them certain characteristics that make them quite interesting from a genetic point of view.
And are there any advantages from an evolutionary perspective, given the nature for people to procreate? Does that offer any advantages?
Yeah, so one of the big questions is, if there are genes that tend to make you gay, wouldn't those genes get lost? Because gay people don't have kids, right? Having sex. Well, first of all, of course, gay people do have kids. I have a daughter. I'm gay. I had a daughter with 2 lesbians, and I passed on all my genes to her as well. But there's another possibility, which is it's possible that a gene that tends to make you gay also gives people other characteristics, which makes them more likely to have children. So, for example, imagine a gene which controlled the time of puberty. In a male, differences in hormone levels might tend to make them more interested in other males. But in a female, that might affect the time of puberty, longer childbearing length, and perhaps have a few more children. Another hypothesis, for which there's actually evidence, I'm not making this up, is that the genes involved in making men like men are also genes that make people more attractive to all sexes, more sexual, essentially. And that also would help the people that have those genes but aren't gay to have more children. So there are a lot of evolutionary possibilities that people are still studying.
So, Dean, I'd really like to dive deeper into this, but before I do, I'd just like to take a step back, because you were informed by Darwin, were you not? You were informed by Kinsey, were you not? How was that information help you in your research?
Yeah. So I think Darwin was a big influence on me because he's the one that essentially said sexual selection is something different than everything else. And you can evolve genes around sexuality much more quickly and much more facilely than anything else, because the gene doesn't really have to help you in a way that we usually think of genes helping us. It just has to make you more sexy. So look at the peacock with its bright tail. That bright tail is useless. It just makes it a target, essentially. But it still gets passed on because female peacocks think it's sexy. So therefore, they have more sex with them and they have more babies. So that makes sexuality genes especially interesting. But probably the biggest influence for me, and I still think one of my biggest heroes, is Alfred Kinsey. So Alfred Kinsey was a guy like me. He was 40 years old. He was doing something on bugs, classifying bugs into little smaller and smaller and smaller classifications. Very interesting if you like bugs. But at some point, he got interested in sex, and he started studying sex. And just like me, he was like, I don't want big picture stuff. I want small, detailed stuff that I can control and that I can record and I can be exact about. Just sort of the same attitude that I have. And that's what he started doing. And all that he did is so simple, was he just went around and asked person after person, what's your sex life like? Who do you think about? Who do you have sex with? How often do you have sex? When did you start having sex? Etc. And he did that on thousands and thousands and thousands of people, and it completely revolutionized our understanding of sexuality in humans. It was really tremendous. I mean, people thought that gays were some sort of aberration that it was very rare and you would never see it, and there wasn't really anybody like that. It was just a weird thing that people did, but that wasn't true. There was lots of gay people and lots of trans people and lots of people in between. And so that always made him a hero to me. Later on, Kinsey was attacked very vehemently by a lot of different people, including other scientists, and that became a little bit familiar also. You can't really work on sexuality without expecting that. So I think he was a tremendous influence on me, and I'm very glad that now my papers from the NIH are at the Kinsey Institute. So there's a little shelf or a box someplace with all that research.
Because Kinsey's work was controversial because it brought to the forefront or to the light the greater awareness of gay people amongst both the sexes.
Yes.
This is the time when being gay was not even under the light of any kind. And yet Kinsey's people showed that there was a significant percentage of the population that either had gay fantasies or actually engaged in gay sex.
He showed there was a lot of variation. And he showed that in every population that he looked at, whether it was school marms or in prisons or any place else, there was a lot of variation in sexuality. And as a good scientist, he did what scientists do. He's the one who developed a measuring tool so that you could measure people's sexuality. The Kinsey scale, 0 if you're absolutely straight, 6 if you're completely gay, everything in between. 3 means you're would be fully bisexual, for example. So he developed a measuring tool. He measured things. He showed what the variation was. And just the observation of those facts and those facts alone were enough to revolutionize people's thinking. People really did believe that there was no such thing as gayness because there weren't gay people. There were just occasional bad acts that people did. But that wasn't right. That was actually not true. Never had been true. So that was a big influence on me. I think the work we did on the genetics of sexuality can be seen in the same way. People at that time, and still up until the 1970s, believed that being gay was a choice, because what else could it be? It was a bad choice. It was a sin. It was against religion. But if you start measuring things, in our case, genes and people's family histories, then you find out, no, that's not the case. There actually is something biological that's tracking with it, so there has to be biological underpinnings.
It's more than considered a bad choice. While studying up, I came across the fact that it was considered medical fact. In fact, there was a prominent New York City psychiatrist called Irving Bieber who said, a homosexual is a person whose heterosexual function is crippled, like the legs of a polio patient. So it was considered an aberration. And yet you had works like Margaret Mead, you had works like Kinsey, who should have informed the way, right?
Yeah.
And did you run into those headwinds when your work first came out?
I want to stress that throughout all of history, homosexuality has been regarded, at least in Western cultures, not necessarily in others, as some sort of aberration. And at first it was religious and bad, but then even with the development of psychiatry and medicine, those myths persisted. And just so that people remember how bad that was, it wasn't just that psychiatrists were saying there's something wrong with you. There were people who were castrated. There were people who had sheep's testicles implanted into them with the hope it would make them more masculine. And there were many, many, many people in the United States, including many veterans, who had lobotomies. They had their forefront of their brain taken out to make them stop being gay. None of it ever worked at all, and it was torture for all of them. It was horrible. And that was even in the guise of science. It was just really bad, non-pseudoscience, something we're coming back to today. By the time I started working in the 90s, that type of theorizing was pretty much gone. But it was replaced by a vehement right-wing Christian attitude of the emergent Tea Party and the beginnings of what turned into the current political situation. And they were very vehemently anti this whole thing. All of the right-wing religious folks said, no, it is not natural. It is a choice, and it's a bad choice. And they were really vehement about that. And it wasn't an argument of logic at all. It was just a belief system, essentially.
But if my understanding is correct, you were pilloried by both the left and the right. So when your paper comes out, what happens next? Could you walk us through?
So
the phone rings off the hook.
When the paper came out, there was a lot of interest. It was on the front page of the New York Times and the Washington Post and the Tokyo Times and the London papers. It was everywhere. and I was on all the news programs, and even on Oprah. So that's the big time, right? It really is.
You made it.
And there was a lot of interest. There was also a lot of criticism. The right-wingers hated it because they said, no, it's a choice. You're trying to naturalize this. You're trying to make it normalized. That's wrong. That's terrible. There was also quite a strong reaction from our own side, from within the LGBT community and from within progressives. They were very concerned that the information would be misused. They were afraid that pre-gay babies might be aborted, for example. They were afraid that the information might be used from the military.
By genetic testing.
By genetic testing, and by other people for genetic testing. People are afraid that it was going to medicalize homosexuality. So you'd say, well, there's a gene defect. There's a mutation. That means it's a sickness, it's an illness, something like that. Those were the fears. And I have to say, at that time, I shared those concerns. I thought it was extremely important to address those concerns. We made sure that we had people within the medical community on our side. And by that, I mean people in the Pediatric Society, people in the Genetics Society, and we made sure that we had their support and their agreement that this type of testing should never be used for that type of purpose, that it was simply. A good case in point is that when I wrote the paper for Science, the last paragraph was a very short paragraph simply saying, these results show that there are natural genetic variations associated with sexual orientation. This does not mean that they are abnormal, that it is just part of existing nature. And the editors at Science said, we have to take that out. And I said, why? And they said, well, that's just an opinion. And I said, yeah, but I'm a scientist, but I'm responsible for the results of my research. I have to. And they said, no, as I'm taking the paper to Nature. And then they said, yes, you can publish the paper the way it is, because it was a big finding. I'm really glad that that paragraph was included. I think it was really important.
And the question from the audience is, did you find a gay gene, or did you find a section of the chromosome that was responsible for the differences that you saw? Can you walk us?
All that we found was a region of the chromosome. We didn't find a gay gene, and as we'll discuss, there isn't a gay gene. There are thousands and thousands of gay genes. And we didn't find the mechanism either, because linkage analysis, what we did, simply can't find that. As a result of that, it's important. I want to go back to the criticisms from the LGBTQ community about this, because those are the criticisms that I listen to, because we don't want to do anything to harm. I don't want to harm myself or my family or my husband or my child or anybody else. That all was back in 1993, so now we have 30 years of experience. And now we can look and see, well, what were the results of that research? Did it harm people? Was it used to medicalize? And the answer is no. There's never been a genetic test used. There's too many genes, for one thing. It's never been used for prenatal diagnosis. It's never been used to discriminate against people. And most important, it had the exact opposite effect of pathologizing being gay. It had the effect of normalizing being gay. And when you have somebody like Lady Gaga singing Born That Way, that's our anthem now. That's like Born Our Way, XQ28, Born That Way. It's actually had a really beneficial effect. Even people on the right wing now reluctantly agree that there's kind of like nothing you can do about it. There just are gay people. They don't like to talk about the biology, but they understand that that's the truth. So it's important to recognize that that's the case. And that's true even if we haven't found a gene, or even if there isn't a gene, even if it's much more complicated than that.
Because people understand that it's rooted in the biology, and that similarly that you can't find some genes. You can't find the genes for height, perhaps.
Exactly.
You can't find the genes for schizophrenia, perhaps. But there it is, right?
Exactly.
Biology drives the behavior.
Yeah.
But can I take you back to the cultural aspects and to the sex aspect of it? Your work was done on males. Have you carried on to look at women?
Yeah. I was very fortunate in that one of my colleagues, a postdoctoral fellow, very talented biologist, Angela Patitucci, was a lesbian, and she was working on the lesbian side of the study. She did everything that we did in males. She did big family studies. She traveled all over the United States. We had all types of big families with tons of lesbians coming into the NIH, to the clinical center. We collected thousands and thousands of DNA samples. We did a lot of different analysis. But the results were quite different. We did not find any particular link. And the linkage at XQ28 that we found for males was clearly not involved in females at all. So all of the family and twin studies say lesbians are just as genetically influenced as are males, but what those genes might be, how they're transmitted, we simply don't know.
I want to spend a few minutes on the cultural aspect of it. Because as you mentioned before, in the West, there's a tendency to put labels. You're a gay person, and as a result, you're not expected to procreate. But in the East, are things more fluid?
We do tend to put labels on things in the West. In the last really recent period, 10 years or so, the idea of fluidity has become much more prominent, both with regard to gender and also with regard to sexuality. And I think that's a good thing, because there is a lot more fluidity. Our particular study focused on the sort of binary perspective, because when you're doing science, when you're looking at something like sexuality, not the best defined thing in the world, and then you're looking at what are a whole bunch of different variables that might control it, what you want to be absolutely sure of is that your phenotypic side is very clear. So you don't want anybody who's maybe a little bit bi or maybe a little bit gay. You want people that are really, really, really gay, like me, for example, and are only interested in sex with men, because then you're sure that they're gay. And actually, you only really want to study gay people and not straight people, because even when people say they're really, really straight, you're not quite as sure. But when somebody says, I'm gay, you can be sure they're telling you the truth, because there's no benefit in lying about that. So our own research really did focus on the binary, and I think that that's the right way to do that type of research. But that doesn't hide the fact that there's a lot more fluidity than that. I'm lucky in that when I officially retired from NIH, I was able to move to Hawaii in the middle of the Pacific. And there, gender and sexuality have always been much more fluid, much more open, much more relaxed and less binary and less regulated, I would say. And there's a tremendous amount of variation. In Hawaii, the people called Mahu, who are what we would call transgender or gender fluid, but who Hawaiians describe as people that have both male and female spirit and heart and mind. And they were once very highly respected. They were healers. They carried on cultural traditions. There is still a Mahu tradition today. For a long time, it was regarded as something really bad. Missionaries didn't like the idea at all, but it's actually been part of culture and part of history for a long time.
And therefore, by applying labels, Kinsey found in his research that there were many men who did not consider themselves gay, but were attracted by gay men. In fact, they were aroused by the sight of male genitalia, and women as well. And therefore, instead of applying labels such as, say, gays or lesbians, would it be okay to label them as, say, a gynephilia, someone who's aroused by women genitalia?
My feeling about labels is you can use whatever labels you want. What's important are people's psyche, what are their desires, and what are their behaviors. And a full compendium of those is the best way to describe things. As it turns out, phenomenologically, men do tend to be either one or the other. Not 100%, not completely at all. But most men tend either to be really attracted to the opposite sex or very strongly attracted to the same sex. Women are very different. Women are much more fluid. There's not any U-shaped curve like that. There really is a bell curve. When I was just learning how to be a sexologist, I was doing all these interviews, and I'll never forget, there was a woman who came in. She was the mother of two brothers that I was studying. She was in her early 80s, She was heterosexual. She'd been married twice. She really liked sex with men. She had never, ever thought about having sex with a woman. Kinsey zero all the way. And at the end of the interview, she says, "Oh, Dr. Hamer, there's something you didn't ask me." I said, "What's that?" She said, "You didn't ask me about my next partner. You know, I'm 80, but I'm still alive." And I said, "Oh." And she said, "Yeah, it'll probably be a woman. Because the men in my age category are horrible. They're just pathetic." I was like, "Oh, thank you for telling me that." You don't get 80-year-old guys suddenly saying, "I think I'm going to go gay now." Just women are a lot different than that. And there's a lot of theorizing about that, why that is. I'm not sure. It may be a social thing. It may be a purely biological, I only have a few eggs to spare thing, or it's probably some mixture of all that.
Now, part of being gay was not just your research was affected, obviously, looked at the molecular side of things, but there were others who studied brain behavior, correct?
Yeah.
And this work was also done in the 90s. What did they find?
Yeah. Simon LeVay is a very good neurobiologist, and he looked at the brains of gay men and compared them to straight men. And he looked in the hypothalamus at a particular region where there was some thought that sexual activity might be coordinated. From work on rats and other experimental animals, he found a real difference in the brains of gay men. And there was a slightly increased area. It looked more like the corresponding area in women, actually, that seemed to correlate pretty strongly. That was a really important finding. It was also controversial and hard to prove because, of course, you're looking at the brains of men that are already gay. You're not looking at their brains as fetuses. So impossible to prove that that was causation, but certainly a really important finding. That was, again, challenged by many people. It was actually replicated by the biggest challenger of that. It remains something to be followed up. And certainly, if a young scientist were going to start looking for proteins that were involved in sexual orientation, that would be a good place to look.
And therefore, that begs the next question, is when do people find out, given that the biology is involved, given that the neuro aspects are involved, when do people find out whether they're gay or not? How early on does this start?
Yeah.
And could you explain from your personal story, perhaps?
Yeah, so from a scientific point of view, I can say that as we were collecting all of these research volunteers and doing questions, we were also asking people about their sexual histories. And that included both all the gay people that we saw, but also all the straight people, all of their brothers and sisters and parents and so on. And gay folks, both gay men and lesbians, develop sexually in exactly the same way as their straight counterparts. They start having sexual thoughts at the same time. They start having sexual feelings around the same time and in the same way. Everything is absolutely parallel. The only difference is that gay people at some point find out that you're not supposed to do that. And then a whole lot of problems start because they feel repressed and they feel scared and there are all types of problems. But in terms of the development of sexuality, absolutely in parallel. For me personally, I can just vaguely remember when I was in nursery school, before kindergarten, that when I was in nursery school, we were supposed to take a nap, which I hated doing, but they made you lie down, and then I would kind of rub myself like that, and then I was thinking about something, and it was usually the Lone Ranger I'd seen, the guy with the mask on. And then the teacher would say something like, "Stop doing that, Dean." And I'd be like, "Stop doing what?" And she was, because I was having sexual feelings, thoughts at that age. That's very typical, absolutely. I didn't understand that further until I was maybe 7 or 8 or 9 or something like that, because now you're watching TV shows and you're seeing what sex is like, and I was like, oh, I think that guy is sexy. And sometime around then you learn that that's not right. And then once puberty hits, it's like, whew, you just can't think about anything else. Just absolutely the same as all the guys that I knew that were thinking about girls. I was just thinking about guys. So I think sexual development is quite parallel. There are other people who don't really develop strong sexual identities until quite later in life. And that also happens both for gay people and for straight people.
And given that now it's no longer being shameful to be gay, are there an increase in numbers of children who are coming out, or has the numbers been consistently the same?
It's a really really hard numbers game to play because it depends on reporting. And the reporting is vastly influenced by the social circumstances. So in the case of LGBT, actually the numbers for people who report as like gay, strictly gay, has stayed pretty constant, like 3, 4, 5%, something in that type of range. But the number of people who report themselves as non-exclusively heterosexual has shot through the roof. I don't think that's a change in what's happening. I just think that's a change in what people are willing to talk about. Where you really see this is in regard to gender. So as late as, when I was starting this research, it was thought the number of transgender people was very small, 0.1%, in that type of range. Today in colleges, 10 or 20% of young girls are identifying as trans or at least gender fluid. So there is some underlying fluidity that's now been released in people, I think for social reasons, that's just become much more evident than it used to be.
And do you think that as time goes on, that people will start identifying themselves with the gender early on, given that now the cultural sort of barriers to what you might have seen in the 50s or 60s, now there's similar barriers to gender?
That's happening to a tremendous degree. There's much more gender fluidity amongst youth than kids identifying. As I mentioned, we have been doing work in Hawaii, and one of the projects we worked on were these 4 stones, a monument to transgender healers who long ago brought healing arts to Hawaii. And there's now a plaque on these stones that says these were dual male and female spirits. And there's a hula show that talks about their story right there in Waikiki Beach. We've had families bring their 4, 5, 6-year-old kids who identify so closely. They're so thrilled to see themselves in that story. And these kids are like really, they're very young.
They're before puberty.
They're way before puberty. They're way before, and they're not sexual. It has nothing to do with sexuality. It's boy, girl. It's gender type of stuff. And they want to be they. And they understand that. And they're thrilled to see an example, a positive example for themselves. So there's a lot more fluidity within human populations than people had recognized previously.
I'm not sure how aware you are of culture, especially in Afghanistan, where it's not uncommon for young boys to dress up as girls and entertain grown men, and it's actually considered quite the norm there. And then these young boys then grow out of that and then come up to be citizens of society as men. Are you aware of this?
I do know a little bit about that, but haven't studied it closely. And it's a little bit hard for me to know how much of their early dressing as girls stuff is like a gender fluidity versus that's just a cultural role that they're expected to play. I just don't know because I'm not familiar enough.
Because I was especially struck by a story because I know there are many parts of Asia, especially when your work had come out, that it said there are no gays here.
Right.
There are no gays in Uganda, and there are no gays in Iran, there are no gays here.
Yeah.
And I always ask myself,
and my partner and I spent 2 years traveling around in rural America, and every place we went, people said there are no gays here, but there were. There always were. And there were their parents there too, who said, I did have kids who were gay, but actually they left because, it's not a good place to be. That's just completely ridiculous when people say that. That's like, it's just a fantasy. They don't want there to be any gays there, but there are.
And now moving from orientation to identity. Where are the lines? Are there lines there, or do you just see them blurring, that people who come out, and how does one transition from one to the other, if there's transition?
Do you mean gender identity?
Yes.
Yes. Yeah. So gender is really different than sexual orientation, because sexual orientation is, do you like men or women? Do you like people of the same sex as yourself or opposite? And gender is, am I a man or am I a woman or am I something else in between? They're obviously orthogonal, that is, they're not dependent on one another. You can be either gay or straight and either trans or cisgendered. But they're also clearly related because, by and large, people who are born with male biology become male identifying people who want to have sex with females, and the exact opposite for females. So closely related, and yet down, I like to think of it as different branching pathways. So it all starts up here with X and Y, and then branch, and then more branch, and then more branch, and then more branch. Gender identity is even less understood than sexual identity. I feel like a man, but I can't really tell you what that means exactly. I just know I like to do manly type of stuff, like play basketball. But I also like to have sex with guys, which is not manly type of stuff. So it's much more complex, I would say. There must be a biological pathway, because you've got to have men feeling like men and women feeling like women in order to have a high rate of reproduction and therefore pass on your genes. But how that works inside the brain is something that people are just beginning to discover.
And yet you have worked in the transgender community in Polynesia. What did you find?
That there is a lot of fluidity, and that there are definitely people who identify with both, and that this is a good thing. Trans people in the Pacific tend to have special talents. They tend to be really good at certain things, better than either men or women, and it's seen as a real blessing by the people around them. I think the biggest thing that I've learned from being in Hawaii and in the Pacific Islands is just how important culture is. Because when you have a culture that says, that's bad, trans is bad, it's terrible, then those people never have an opportunity to contribute to society. They're cast out. They're forced into sex work, or they're just, in jail or whatever. When you give them an opportunity, they can do so much. They can contribute so much. It's in the most wonderful, positive ways. A lot of our work has been done with a really wonderful Mahu cultural icon, Kumuhina, that we've learned so much from, and that the whole society has learned so much from. So culture does make a big difference, both in individuals' life, but it helps the society too. I think Hawaii is richer because of the contributions of Mahu.
And does it not intrigue you as a molecular scientist when you look at the cultures in Polynesia to say, is there a molecular component to?
Yeah. So I'm just going to say probably not. Any theory that says there's like differences between groups of people, racial groups of people, in terms of their behavior, I'm right. That's probably not a good idea.
Why not?
Because there simply isn't enough genetic variation between groups to explain those types of differences. It'd be like, why do Indians eat vegetarian food all the time? It must be genetic, right? And I'm sure I could do a study that showed some genetic correlation with something, some Indianist thing, type of thing, and it's just complete garbage. There's so much more variation between people than there is between groups that's really, really unlikely. But what I do think is revealed by looking at different cultural groups is that you can see how much variation there is in the underlying biology when it's allowed to show through. So, in other words, to go to the silly example of vegetarian versus, if you just looked in Westerners, you'd think people have to eat meat to survive. It's clear, and everybody knows that. That's why they're out stabbing animals, and that's from the very evolution of mankind. We evolved to hunt and stuff, and because it's necessary. But then if you go to India, there's a lot of people here who aren't eating meat at all, and you realize, actually our biology does not require meat to exist. It can do just fine on vegetables. So to me, the cultural flexibility is a way of unveiling and unmasking and seeing all the biological variability that there is and that's available to us as a species.
Moving on from sexual orientation and gender identity, now we're going to faith. What led to that transition? Here you were, and if one controversial subject wasn't enough, you've now waded into deeper waters.
So, I was talking with this guy, Robert Cloninger, who's a very well-known sort of behavioral psychiatrist, molecular biologist type of guy. And I was talking about our research on sexual orientation. And he said, what you should really be studying is spirituality. And I said, are you kidding me? That's the stupidest thing I've ever heard. And he said, but people pray a lot more often than they have sex. And I thought, that's true. And then I read a little bit of his work and other work. and started thinking, religion is a pretty powerful force. And by the way, if you're gay, you realize that all the time, because the greatest force aligned against us, inevitably, at least in Western culture, has been the church. They are not friends of the gays, by and large. Some are okay, but by and large. So I just started thinking about that a little bit. And then I have to admit, it was a bit fortuitous. As we had been studying sexual orientation, we'd been giving people this character and personality inventory, because we wanted to see if there was any correlations and anything that was genetically mediated. And one of the scales on this personality test was called self-transcendence. And I'll admit, it was on the scale. That's the only reason it was included. I never thought about it very much, but I started looking into it. And it's a very interesting scale because it tries to understand why humans tend to be so spiritual and so much believe in faith. And it divides this into a couple of different categories. The idea of mysticism. Do you believe there are certain things that happen for no particular reason? Or do you sometimes feel there's a secret voice speaking to you? Self-transcendence, which is, do you sometimes feel connected to something larger? It might be nature, or it might be the universe, or it might be a higher power, which is what we call religion. And also absorption. Do you sometimes get so absorbed in things you're doing that you lose track of time, for example? And it turns out this personality trait is unique. It's not like anxiety or conviviality or anything else. And it just made me kind of curious whether there might be a genetic basis to it or not.
And what did you find?
There is. And twin studies show that there's a pretty decent heritability. 40 or 50% of the variation between people can be attributed to genetics. And so we did what we do as molecular biologists. We started testing DNA and testing. We had to use, in this case, a larger population than we had for the gay stuff, because the trait is more ambiguous, frankly. And we found a couple of connections. One of them really stood out. It's for something called the VMAT2 gene, which is a gene that coordinates the transport of monoamines. Monoamines are important chemicals in the brain. Probably everybody knows serotonin. That's the one that can make you depressed. Dopamine is one of the molecules that makes you excited. And it's one of the molecules that handles that. So we think it has something to do with people's consciousness, and that in turn connects them to this outer world that makes people spiritual.
So, Dean, I want to go deeper into this, but by now, they've been accepted that there was a molecular basis for sexuality. And establishment came along, the institutions came along. And now you look at faith, and there's blowback from established members of the church. They were eager to accept a molecular component to your sexual identity, but they were not ready to accept a molecular component to faith. Why was there not?
Because if you believe in God, you don't believe in all this other stuff. And what was interesting about it is the finding that humans are naturally tend to be religious or spiritual says nothing about whether what you believe in is true or false. I was interviewed by a person who made a film called Ridiculous, which is about how religion is completely bunk and it's not true and there is no God, etc. And he really wanted me to say, I've shown that there's a gene for it, so there is no God. And I said, I can't say that. I absolutely can't say that, because it doesn't just, prove that at all. And so I got cut to a really short part of that movie. But if you think about it, if you believe that there's a God, then certainly you can believe that God gave us all genes that make us ready to believe in him, right? And if you don't believe in God, you can think, we all got genes that make us believe in this ridiculous fantasy. It just says absolutely nothing about it. It just tells you about the mechanism, not whether it's good or bad, or whether the God is true or false.
But you went further than that. You said there were inherent advantages to having the gene.
Well, if you got a gene, it has to not be bad for you, and should be a little bit good. I think that other people researching this really in depth, who have done long-term studies of the sort we just don't do, have shown that the tendency to believe and to be faithful and to be spiritual is also associated with better health outcomes, longer life. As also is being friendly and having a good social life, and a lot of different things that all sort of go together in my mind. So I can't say that this gene is making you more faithful, but or live longer, but they all seem to be associated. What it helps me understand is, as someone who's not religious, I always thought, well, religion was just a way of explaining things that people couldn't explain. So once you can explain it by science, that's the end of that. This is not the case. Science has not replaced religion at all. In fact, people are becoming more religious and more spiritual in some ways. It has its own long-lasting, permanent place in human life, and it's not going away. It's just not going to go away.
And are you, in your work, have you separated faith from religion? After all, there are many countries that are less religious but are more faith, especially in the Western European countries.
Yeah, this scale that we're using was very specifically designed to separate religion from faith. There's no questions about God or anything that you would think of as a religious question. It's all about personal attitudes and feelings and emotions that are associated with, again, this sort of transcendence, this feeling that there's something outside of you, which is true of all religious faiths. So, yeah, and that's not going to go away. It's just the way that the human brain works, is this desire for there to be something more, to be connected with something outside. And it can't be replaced by money or by science or by understanding or by intellect. It's something that humans apparently were evolved to want.
And given that there are some societies where organized religion has been rooted out, say communist Russia, for example, the Soviet Union, what did you find there?
Not for long it wasn't rooted out, because now religion is ascendant in Russia. And the same in communist China. China does a good job of rooting things out. They're really very, extremely thorough, I can assure you. And as soon as things were relaxed at all, everybody's doing spiritual practices. Buddhism is coming back very strongly. People really want that. It's never been wiped out, not even vaguely at all. And even if organized religions are rooted out, the sort of blind faith in a leader is something which hasn't gone away at all. And we can see that in current society. It's gotten worse. I shouldn't say worse, stronger, if anything. So it's not. What it does tell us is that what's important is not to try to get rid of faith or spirituality. It's to try and have the faith and spirituality be directed in a way that's useful for human beings. Because the way this instinct works is you can be faithful and believe in something that's good for everybody, but you can be equally strongly faithful and religious about something that's bad for everybody. Look at Shakerism, for example. Very nice socially, but you can't have any children. It's not going to make a very good society. And we have much worse examples today of things that are horrible for the population, horrible for individuals. Faith-based belief that vaccines are bad for you. In the era of infectious diseases, I mean, this is ridiculous, but you're not going to be able to shake people's wanting to believe in something. You just have to make sure that they believe in the right thing.
And therefore, you mentioned the evolutionary advantages. There was a study done in the Balkans as to identity. And they said, well, who are you really? And a Serb said, well, I've been a Serb, I've been an Orthodox Christian and my parents before me and their parents before me. And so it turns out that wasn't true, because the Balkans there was such fluidity between the Ottomans and the Austro-Hungarian Empire that people switched identities and people changed religions in order to survive, in order to flourish. Could that have played a role in your statement about how the God gene, however you term it, does offer advantages that those people survived, and the people who didn't believe, they might have passed on? Is there any?
Maybe. I'd have to do a study. Yeah. You can also just believe that it's a belief that there is something beyond and that you have something to live for. to give you the optimism. There's been a lot of theorizing about how religion and spirituality give people just the belief to go on, essentially.
Say the Jews of Spain, for example, post the Reconquista, when they went undercover, they still practiced Judaism,
Right.
but on the surface they paid lip service to Christianity.
Yeah, Jews have survived for a long time, even though people really don't like them very much, and they have a lot of faith.
So where's the status of that faith-based molecular biology now?
So I think there's something we need to discuss about that we haven't discussed yet, but that's very important for understanding the tie between genetics and behavior in all of the research we're discovering, which is when we started our research, no one had ever looked at a complex trait like a behavior in its genetics. And when we did the work on sexual orientation, it was clear right away there wasn't just one gene, because there was no yes-no type of answer. And we thought, oh, there's probably maybe 10 different genes, if we're lucky. But there could be as many as 100, but maybe 10 or 20 sounded reasonable. As the technology has gotten more powerful, that number has expanded and expanded and expanded. So now people have this GWAS method that allows you to look at jillions of genomes of huge populations collected for big health studies and stuff. The most recent study of sexual orientation found at least 50,000 genes that were associated with sexual orientation. 5 of them were significant, but all of the other ones were important each. This is a lot of genes. Each single gene, even the biggest one, at most had a 0.1% impact, and most of them were 0.01 or 0.001% impact. Why the variation is, and furthermore, of those thousands of genes, none of them were exclusively dedicated to this. All of them had multiple other overlapping factors in brain function and in immunology and in various other areas, in attraction, in physical characteristics, and so on. So what's happened, what Mother Nature has done, is instead of causing variation by making a change in the gene 1, gene 2, gene 3 that lead to the pathway, it just makes little tiny changes in the environment of your entire brain all over the place, which added together cause a different phenotype. And the phenotype can be binary. It can be either black or white and still be controlled by thousands of genes. This is a big mystery. Nobody predicted this when they started sequencing the genome. For the purposes of understanding behavior, it's very useful because now we understand there is no single master gene that does everything. Everything has this level of complexity, whether it's faith or sexuality or gender or schizophrenia or alcoholism or personality traits, they all operate this way. What it does tell us is that as biochemists, genetics is not useful. You can't study 10,000 proteins. It's just ridiculous. That's just not the way things work. So this has really changed the whole field and the understanding of it. So we're not going to understand the tendency to spirituality by doing genetics. We might understand more by doing really fine brain scans, and we'll find out even more as people begin to understand how neurons actually encode thoughts, which is the big mystery in biology, really.
So spirituality maybe, but are there other frontiers that you see yourself as the area of genetics moving forward into, in explaining behavior, explaining violence perhaps, explaining certain alcoholism, explaining certain proclivities to do some, where do you see the field going? You started it.
I know. It was a good idea, it really was. I think that classical genetics is not going to answer any of those questions. I think classic neurobiology and neurochemistry at a very, very fine, minute level will help to provide some answers. I think it's conceivable. You can still get lucky because you can make mutations in genes, and if they're in the pathway, it will mess things up, and it will tell you what the actual pathway is. So where there may be some luck is there are folks now that are doing sort of big mutant searches. Remember back when back when we were doing this stuff, people were doing that in C. elegans, the simple
Yes.
roundworm, and they found out a
Simple.
lot about it. A lot about it. There are people doing that now in mice and stuff. So to the extent that mice do the same behaviors that we do, which is only a limited extent, people might find some really interesting stuff. And if people found mice that were strongly attracted to the same sex, that would be awesome. Or if people found mice that were acting like the gender opposite to their biological or chromosomal sex, that would be absolutely awesome. And I think that it could tell us something about the pathway without any worrying that would be somehow manipulated or the like. So there might be some place to go there.
Are there evidence of gender identity or sexual identity in the animal kingdom?
There's a lot of gender fluidity. There's lots of animals that change sexes all the time as they want. Not in the way that we think about in humans so much. And there's good examples in sexuality too. You know, Drosophila sexuality has been all worked out to a pin. It's just absolutely beautiful. There's this very specific pathway. It's got branch points. There's a very specific part of the brain that goes male or female, and then another part of that tells you what mating behaviors to do, and they grab onto each other's tail, and they do these little rumba lines and stuff, and we know all about that in detail. Has no applicability to humans. Our setup is just completely different, but we're at least understanding that. And to me, that's important, because again, in terms of fundamental biology, our biology is all related. Our evolution is all related. So I think it's really interesting and important to find out. I think with the current climate about science and the absolute insistence on practical results immediately, there's going to be a dearth of research and that is really a pity, because almost everything, all of our advances in science, all our advances in technology have come out originally from basic research. So to give up basic research would truly be a tragedy.
So let's take you back 30 years. You are now on the lookout for the so-called gay gene. What were the biggest fears?
My biggest hope was that the research would inspire other people to research the same area. And that, you know, I was relatively protected being a gay person. No one was going to attack me of being anti-gay or whatever. But there's a lot more straight researchers, and that it would allow other people to come into the field, and that there would be more general interest. And my greatest fear was that there'd be a backlash, that the backlash would be so severe that it would inhibit things. So over the last 20, 30 years, things were developing well. Just recently, things have taken a different turn, and I can't be blamed for that. So I hope that this will be a temporary break in the arc, and that things will continue to improve.
Because science has sometimes unfortunate repercussions. Sex selection is widely used in many parts of Asia.
True.
Were you concerned at all, or did that come up, or has it come up since, on selection and, say, the testing for, say, a gay gene or gay babies? Or
Yeah. I wouldn't do this research if I thought that was a realistic probability. But first of all, I believe that as scientists, it is possible to control the scientific and medical establishment to do the right thing, and largely that's been true. And second of all, from practical terms now, we know there's never going to be any gay gene test. There's 10,000 genes. It's just not going to be possible at all. And third of all, there are so many important benefits of understanding how sexuality works. You know, the reason that people were tortured and put to death and burned to death and had goat testicles implanted in them, it wasn't because people knew about the sexuality, it's because people didn't know. And the reason people died of AIDS when they didn't have to wasn't because people didn't know that there was drugs, it's because people refused to give them drugs. So I think that knowledge is always better than disknowledge. And I think that for an area like sexuality, where there is controversy and there is a lot of emotion and there is a lot of personal feeling, I think that knowledge is the best solution. I'll always believe that.
And as this drives forward, because there's obviously the insurance companies, the health-based companies that can test you for many things, that there could be a dystopian future where this could have unintended consequences.
You know, that's, again, possible. For the reasons I just said, of there being so many genes, it's never going to happen. Also, the insurance company is regulated. And the truth of the matter is, if there were a way to do some sort of selection, and there's not, the people who would be using it would be gay parents, and they'd want to have gay kids. And I know that because I have 2 lesbian moms that have my daughter, and they would have preferred a lesbian daughter, actually. We thought we were getting the right places, and then as soon as she left for college, she turned straight. So what are you going to do?
Could you have done the work today that you did 30 years ago?
I don't think so. No, I actually don't. I don't think I could have done it at NIH, and I don't think I could have done it at a university right now. A year ago, yes, probably. But right at this moment, no. But I have friends who are doing research on COVID treatments and heart attack pills that aren't able to work right now. I think shutting down science is just like the worst idea I've ever heard of in my life. It's inconceivable that that's going to happen. But here we are.
So Dean Hamer, you started off with working on metallothionein genes. You then moved on to look for human sexuality. And then there was faith. And then you moved on to take a look at transgender identities in Polynesia. Where are you going to go next?
I think right now we're at a point, in particular in the LGBTQ, Mahu, transgender point, where we thought he had made a lot of progress, and suddenly we're seeing that being eroded. And there's a great desire for us to do something permanent and something long-lasting. My days as a scientist, as a bench scientist, are over. That's best done when you're still young and fresh. So right now I'm working with my partner and my husband, Joe Wilson, on trying to mark our gay lives and stories on the permanent landscape. And in Hawaii, we're working on a memory site for the community, also a memorial for HIV/AIDS, and trying to remind people of all the pain and the suffering caused by homophobia and transphobia, but also to remind people of the very positive power for everybody of being more inclusive and being more accepting. And in Hawaii, there's a long tradition of same-sex relations and of gender fluidity that provides a marvelous example. There's a long history of dealing with diseases like HIV/AIDS in a rational way. There was needle exchange in Hawaii and education. And we want to remind people that we're here, we're always going to be here, and the more that we are part of the world with you, the better the world's going to be.
And we've talked a lot about the molecular aspects of it. We've never talked about the environmental aspects of it. How does that inform your sexuality or your faith? Nature versus nurture, perhaps.
The environment is hugely important in that I was lucky to grow up in an environment that allowed me to be myself without being put in prison or having goat testicles implanted in me. So yes, the environment is important. It's not what gave me my sexuality any more than it gave me my gender or my sex or my blue eyes or my gray hair. Those are all just part of me, and it took a while for some of them to develop. But yeah, environment is important in how people live in the world, but it's not what makes you who you are.
Thank you. And on that note, I'd like to thank you for coming. Dean Hamer, welcome to the Common Club, and thank you for a wonderful discussion.
Thank you so much.
Thank you.